which brings back to Peter Schroff, like it or not.
Okay.
It was like performance art. I had always really liked the idea of Peter Schroff. Now I love the person of Peter Schroff.
Do you?
Oh my goodness. It was, you know, I mean, so yesterday, Derek Riley and I, which will be out today, I suppose, had Chris Burkhardt on the podcast, right? Phenomenal speaker, did a TED Talk, right? So it was really a thoughts on point, articulate, intelligent, well-traveled, knows what he's talking about. Great, right? Like, perfect podcast. But man, I like the weird ones. And Peter Schroff sent it.
Well, look.
There was 30 minutes of that cut out. 30 minutes of that podcast was edited out because it was the part that was there was the part that was sensible enough to air.
Crazy.
He refused to understand Derek, which was completely awesome. So Derek just sat back the entire time.
No, Derek tried hard for the first 3 minutes.
Yeah.
And Peter'd be like, wait, what'd you say?
Yeah.
Like when you said couldn't understand, you mean he couldn't understand his Australian accent.
Exactly.
That's as simple as it was.
Refused to understand.
And Peter goes, what did you say? And then Derek would like rephrase it in a slightly less like witty wording, like a more straightforward wording. And then Peter'd go, it'd be dead silence. And then you would jump in and say it with an American accent. Peter, I really wanted to make it to the end of it.
Sure.
He was completely nonsensical. And also like, I agree with you. I like the idea of Peter and I like having a rabble rouser period. But he sounded crazy.
I'll tell you, the surf world does not deserve a Peter Schroff. Peter Schroff is an artist. I feel spending that time with him chatting, I think it was probably close to 2 hours total. I really truly fell head over and heels in love with Peter Schroff.
You guys couldn't wrangle. It was funny hearing you trying.
There was
like
no
a couple
wrangling.
times. Like, what did you say?
I'm not good at wrangling anyway, but like Derek is usually the better wrangler. I'll just go off on tangents, obviously. But I was transfixed. I mean, I think it got cut out of the podcast, but we got a whole virtual tour of Peter Schroff's design hotel everything he's doing is mind blowing.
I can't believe he finishes any of it.
I mean, it was his design hotel was in stinking San Pedro. Have you spent much time in San Pedro?
When I was young. Yeah.
San Pedro is a rough,
Yeah.
I'll tell you,
It is.
I think there is only one place where Japanese people are homeless in the entire world. Imagine homeless Japanese.
Can't imagine it.
Doesn't exist in Japan. It exists in San Pedro. There are homeless Japanese people in San Pedro. There's guys dragging off tanker ships at whatever in the morning to go drink in whatever bars. Like, it is a rough, blue collar, Bukowski-esque sailing town. And so Peter Schroff opened a design hotel there where rooms are themed like the Chanel room. I don't think that's what it's called, but it was all Chanel design. And I think there was a Dior room. Epic. Like in San Pedro.
It's open to the public?
It felt like it was open. I don't know. It wasn't a hotel proper. It felt like, I didn't get into the specifics of how you book it.
Airbnb or something.
It seemed like something like that, but it was there was themed rooms. It was not, and it was not poorly done. I mean, it was impeccably done, like artistically done. I mean, it was a work of art.
One thing that I did catch in the podcast was the Kelly Slater story about Kelly saying that he's confused about it must be sad to be a 60-year-old
sexually
confused on drugs.
He says he's
blah,
not
blah,
gay.
blah. Well, what was funny is Derek asked Peter about that, and Peter goes, "Did Kelly say that?"
Yeah.
He goes, "I didn't even know that he said that." And then Derek reads him the quote, and then Peter's like, "Oh, I didn't even know he said that." So yeah, he called me the next day and apologized about that, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, wait, you just said that you didn't even know that Kelly made those comments about you, but then you said that he called you the next day to apologize?
Maybe he didn't know why Kelly was calling. Maybe he just thought, I'm sure that Kelly, he probably hears a lot of things that Kelly says about him. Maybe.
I don't know. But that was just one instance where I was like, wait, Peter, what?
Yeah, yeah.
Doesn't make any sense at all.
It was one of those, and it was frustrating to me conducting, hanging on for the ride on that interview. that we weren't doing it live. Like for other people to be able to see it and experience. I mean, it was an experience, which is what he is, right? He is an artist who does performance art. To me, it felt like a performative piece for the audience of me and Derek, so I felt really lucky to be able to experience it. And again, I'll say surfing does not deserve Peter Schroff, but we are lucky to have him. And I wonder in the future, if the Schroff era, if what he did here will get magnified, like we'll get people say, okay, surfing went through this really dull phase when the WSL took over and tried to homogenize everything, but not homogenize it in even an interesting way. Like this real lowest common denominator, this guy from Oprah, literally Oprah, came over and did this. And it was so terrible. The pros were really good at surfing, but otherwise there was no storyline there. And so you had this, all the brands went out of business. So nobody was pushing any other narrative, right? Where again, this is looking back on this era of pro surfing where it had flatlined. And then you have a guy in a Speedo with a utility belt on carving up Kelly Slater surfboards and Hayden shapes with a chainsaw. And then, I don't know, there's something, Peter Schroff is the only thing keeping surfing's pulse pounding right now. Like surf culture's pulse pounding.
So yeah, those things are great visuals and they're a great headline. So when you interview him, I want to hear why or what. Yeah, and he can't even
deliver. Of course, but if he could, then he would be, the fact that he's performance artist all the time makes it, like if he could sit back and articulate, if he could say, well, let me tell you why I'm doing this, then you lose the performative. Agreed.
Art doesn't need to be explained necessarily, but when what he provides is as context is him making slanted eyes on an Instagram post, that now feels racist. And that now feels like it throws like, hey, I was paying attention to you being anti-Asian manufacturing and being pro-American manufacturing, but now you've driven this conversation off into a ditch with racist rhetoric.
Sure, but anybody who's that far beyond the wire, like, is going to say all kinds of whack. I mean, like, holding him to any kind of standard, I think, is inappropriate for us. Like, we just got to let him be out there. I mean, of course, you cross a line when you advocate, whatever, violence against minorities or something.
But I agree with what you're saying, too, is like, you got to give a little more grace to performance art or comedians or artists in general. But I still want to hear what you're saying. I'm going to listen. If he ends up on a podcast or with a headline, I'm going to read it and I'm going to listen. But each time I take one step closer to listening than just the superficial, he completely loses me.
So I suppose that's the problem, is podcast is definitely not the medium.
Definitely not.
It should have been, he's a visual artist. That should have been like a Facebook Live thing where it doesn't even stay in the archive, or it could stay in the archive, but people should have tuned into that as it was happening because it was a real thing, right? Yeah. Like it was a piece of art that doesn't translate to straight audio.
Right. Yeah. It was interesting.
Yeah. Fun. I loved it. Loved every second.
Do you think if you gave him money for a surfboard that you would ever complete it and deliver it?
I think he would. And I want to. Okay. Like my next board is going to be a Peter Schroff.
Okay. Yeah. So he is still manufacturing surfboards?
Yeah. He does I think he does 1 or 2 a day or something. He says on there.
Okay, good.